Pope Leo XIV never expected that a simple walk would shatter centuries of Vatican protocol and change everything he thought he knew about mercy. But on this particular morning, as the American pontiff stood at his window watching Rome stir beneath, since his election just 3 months ago, the early light filtered through the tall windows of his private quarters, casting familiar shadows across the polished marble floor. Outside, the eternal city hummed with its morning rhythm-distant church bells, marking the hour. The soft murmur of pilgrims already gathering in St. Peter's Square, and the gentle cooing of pigeons that had made the Vatican colonnade their permanent home. Leo breathed it all in, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, feeling the weight of his white cassock against his shoulders, like a reminder of everything he had never quite grown comfortable carrying. Behind him, his young assistant, Antonio, shuffled through papers with the quiet efficiency that had made him indispensable to 3 different papal administrations. The soft rustle of documents, the careful clicking of his pen, the occasional clearing of his throat, these sounds had become the soundtrack of Leo's mornings, as predictable as the sunrise itself. "Your Holiness," Antonio began, his voice carrying that particular tone of respectful urgency that meant the day's obligations were pressing. "Cardinal Bertoli is expecting you in the Apostolic Palace at 9 sharp for the consistory preparation. We should review the agenda items before." Leo turned from the window, offering the gentle smile that had become his trademark in the brief months since his surprising elevation to the papacy. "Antonio," he said quietly, "how long since I've walked the full perimeter?" The assistant blinked, clearly caught off guard by the question. He consulted his ever-present folder, flipping through pages of meticulously planned routes and security. "Protocols, the full perimeter, Your Holiness, I believe." "Well, the last recorded perimeter walk was during the Easter Vigil, but that was ceremonial." "With full escort, and I mean alone," Leo interrupted gently, "or as alone as they'll allow me to be." Antonio's face tightened with the expression of a man who could already see his carefully orchestrated morning dissolving into chaos. 20 minutes later, Pope Leo XIV stepped through a discreet side entrance of the Apostolic Palace, flanked by 2 plainclothes Swiss guards who had clearly drawn the short straw that morning. Marco, the senior officer, walked with the rigid posture of a man whose carefully planned security protocols had just been thrown out the window by papal whim. Antonio trailed behind them, clutching his leather folder like a life preserver in a storm he hadn't seen coming. The Vatican gardens stretched before them in the soft morning light. Meticulously maintained paths winding between ancient olive trees and perfectly manicured hedges. This was familiar territory, the safe, predictable route that Leo had walked dozens of times since his election. Always with purpose, always toward a destination clearly marked on Antonio's schedule. But today, something pulled him away from the well-worn stones. "Your Holiness," Marco said carefully, his Italian accent thick with barely concealed anxiety, "the usual route to the Paul VI audience hall is this way. Cardinal Bertoli will be expecting." "I know where Cardinal Bertoli will be," Leo replied gently, his American accent still drawing curious glances from Vatican staff even after 3 months. He paused at a fork in the path, his eyes drawn toward the less traveled route that led toward the outer walls. "But I think today we'll take the long way." Marco exchanged a glance with his partner, their silent communication perfected through years of protecting pontiffs who occasionally made decisions that gave security nightmares. "The perimeter route hasn't been swept this morning, Holy Father. We have no advance team positioned as they approached the outer edge of the Vatican grounds." The sounds began to filter through the stone barriers, not the usual tourist chatter or Roman traffic, but something else. Voices, tired and weathered, the crackle of a small fire, the soft murmur of people who had nowhere else to go. Leo slowed his pace, his trained ear picking up fragments of conversation in Italian, mixed with other languages he couldn't identify. Antonio appeared at his elbow, perspiration beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Perhaps we should return to the scheduled route," Antonio suggested, his voice tight with diplomatic urgency. But Leo had stopped walking entirely now. Through a gap in the ancient wall, partially obscured by overgrown ivy, he caught sight of a small makeshift camp, cardboard shelters, worn blankets, and there sitting apart from the others with a dignity that somehow transcended her circumstances. A woman with graying hair pulled back neatly, reading what appeared to be a tattered book, something in her posture. in the careful way she held herself, made Leo's breath catch in his throat. "Holy Father, no." Move toward a section of the wall where an old maintenance gate stood slightly ajar. "This area is not secure. We have no protocols for," but Leo was already reaching for the weathered iron handle, his movements deliberate, despite the tension crackling around him like electricity before a storm. The gate creaked open on hinges that had seen decades of Roman weather, and suddenly the careful barrier between the Vatican and the world dissolved into nothing more than a few steps across worn cobblestones. The encampment was a dozen people who had claimed this forgotten corner where Vatican walls met a narrow Roman alley. Most were still asleep beneath layers of mismatched blankets and cardboard, but a few stirred at the sound of the gate, their eyes widening as they took in the surreal sight of the Pope himself stepping into their world. Leo's attention, however, remained fixed on the woman he had glimpsed through the ivy. Up close, she was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair that had been carefully braided despite her circumstances. She wore a faded blue coat that had once been elegant, and her worn shoes were positioned neatly beside her makeshift cedar wooden crate covered with a threadbare blanket. The book in her hands was a collection of Italian poetry, its pages yellow with age and handling. She looked up as his shadow fell across her reading, and for a moment time seemed to suspend itself in the narrow space between Vatican walls and Roman streets. Her dark eyes held a intelligence that spoke of education, of a life that had once included libraries and classrooms, and the luxury of reading for pleasure rather than escape. "Scusi," she whispered, scrambling to her feet with a dignity that made Leo's chest tighten. She clutched the book against her coat, her face flushing with a mixture of shock and shame. "I am sorry, we were not. I did not know, ... Please," Leo said gently, raising his hand in a gesture that was both blessing and plea. "Don't apologize. I'm the one who should ask forgiveness for intruding." The Pope took another step forward, closing the distance between them to something almost conversational. "What are you reading?" he asked softly, as she held the poetry collection, her knuckles white against the faded cover. For a heartbeat, she seemed caught between the instinct to flee and the impossibility of the moment unfolding before her. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the careful diction of someone who had once stood before classrooms, who had once been listened to with respect. "Montale," she said quietly, her eyes darting between Leo's face and the ground. "Eugenio Montale. I was a literature teacher before ... The sentence hung unfinished in the morning air, weighted with everything that before had once contained. Pope Leo XIV felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. Here was a woman who had known libraries and lesson plans, who had once guided young minds through the complexities of Italian verse, now reduced to reading poetry by the Vatican walls because she had nowhere else to go. "One of my favorites during seminary," he smiled gently, though I confess my Italian wasn't quite ready for his subtleties then. The admission drew perhaps even the ghost of a teacher's satisfaction across Maria Elena's weathered features. She looked up at him fully for the first time, and Leo saw in her dark eyes the accumulated weight of months, or perhaps years of being invisible, of being stepped around rather than acknowledged. "You read Italian poetry?" she asked, her voice stronger now, touched with the faintest note of professional curiosity overriding her mortification. "When time allows," Leo replied, "though I suspect you could teach me things about Montale that no seminary professor ever managed." Maria Elena noticed the gathering attention and instinctively stepped backward, her shoulders curving inward as if she could make herself smaller, less visible. "Your Holiness," she whispered, "people are watching. This will cause problems for you." But Leo moved with her, maintaining the intimate distance of their conversation, his presence creating a small sanctuary in the growing chaos. "My name is Leo," he said gently, "and you are?" She hesitated, as if she had grown unaccustomed to being asked for her name rather than simply moved along. "Maria Elena," she said finally. "Maria Elena Rossi." The crowd pressed closer now, a growing circle of curious faces and raised phones that turned their quiet conversation into an impromptu theater. Maria Elena's eyes darted nervously between the onlookers and Pope Leo XIV, her grip tightening on the worn poetry book as if it were the last solid thing in a world suddenly spinning beyond her control. Holy Father, Antonio appeared at Leo's elbow, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. The media will wait, Leo said firmly, never taking his eyes from Maria Elena's face. The gentle authority in his voice created a small pocket of calm amid the chaos. How long have you been teaching, Maria Elena? She hesitated. At Liceo Classico, Giulio Cesare, until ... Her voice cracked, and she looked away. Leo waited, his patience as deliberate as a prayer. Around them, the murmur of the crowd grew loud. Tourists snapping photos, locals whispering rapid Italian to each other. A news crew setting up equipment with practiced efficiency. But in the eye of this growing storm, the Pope stood motionless, offering Maria Elena the rarest gift anyone had given her in months' time. My mother got sick, she continued, the words coming slowly, painfully. Alzheimer's. I took a leave of absence to care for her, but the leave became ... longer. The medical bills, the medications, not covered by insurance. She pressed her lips together, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. When she died, I had nothing left. No job, they couldn't hold my position forever. No savings, no family. A reporter pushed forward with a microphone, but Marco stepped smoothly into his path, his expression brooking no argument. The Swiss Guard's intervention barely registered with Leo, whose entire attention remained focused on the woman before him. The apartment went first, Maria Elena whispered, her voice growing smaller with each admission. Then I lived in my car until they repossessed it. I tried the shelters, but they're full, and the waiting lists ... She shrugged, the gesture carrying the weight of 1,000 small defeats. I know this area. I used to bring my students here for field trips, talking about art and history and God's presence in beauty. She gestured toward the Vatican walls with something that might have been irony if it weren't so heartbreaking. I never imagined I'd be reading Montale outside these walls because I had nowhere else to go. Leo felt something crack open in his chest as he watched this educated, dignified woman explain how quickly respectability could crumble. The crowd continued to grow, voices rising, cameras clicking, but all he could see was Maria Elena Rossi, literature teacher, reduced to homelessness by nothing more than love and circumstance. You brought students here, he said softly. Tell me what you taught them. The black Mercedes arrived with the subtle urgency that marked all Vatican crisis management doors, closing with expensive precision, polished shoes clicking against cobblestones with military efficiency. Cardinal Bertoli emerged first, his crimson robes a stark contrast to the morning's casual chaos, followed by 2 other senior officials whose faces carried the particular strain of men, watching centuries of protocol dissolve in real time. Your Holiness, Cardinal Bertoli called out, his voice carrying across the crowd with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. The consistory awaits. We must return to the palace at once. Pope Leo XIV didn't move. He remained standing beside Maria Elena, whose face had gone pale at the sight of the Vatican's administrative power descending upon their small corner of Roman street. The crowd, sensing the dramatic tension, pressed closer, phones held high to capture whatever would unfold next. Maria Elena, you mentioned bringing students here to talk about God's presence and beauty. His voice carried a gentleness that somehow cut through the growing cacophony around them. What did you tell them about sanctuary? She blinked, caught off guard by the question. We talked about the ancient right of sanctuary, how churches once offered protection to anyone who sought it, regardless of their circumstances. Cardinal Bertoli reached them now, his expression a masterclass in diplomatic fury. Holy Father, this spectacle must end. The media presence alone is documenting something important, Leo interrupted, his American directness cutting through Italian diplomacy like a blade. He turned to face the cardinal fully, and something in his posture made the crowd fall silent. Cardinal Bertoli, I'd like you to meet Maria Elena Rossi. She's a teacher. The cardinal's eyes flicked between the Pope and the homeless woman, his political instincts clearly screaming warnings. Your Holiness. Perhaps we could arrange for proper assistance through appropriate channels. She's coming inside, Leo said simply. The words landed like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of shock through everyone within hearing distance. Antonio's mouth fell open. Marco's hand instinctively moved toward his radio. Maria Elena stepped backward, as if she'd been struck. "Your Holiness," she whispered, that's impossible. "I can't." "You can," Leo said firmly, extending his hand toward her. "The Vatican has guest quarters that haven't been used in months. You'll be my personal guest for as long as you need sanctuary." Cardinal Bertoli's face had gone ashen. "Holy Father, there are protocols, procedures, security clearances, then we'll figure them out," Leo replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had made a decision that surprised even himself. He looked back at Maria Elena, whose dark eyes were wide with disbelief. "Unless you'd prefer to stay here," the crowd held its breath. Cameras clicked furiously. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour that Cardinal carefully planned consistory would begin without the Pope. Maria Elena looked at Leo's outstretched hand as if it were offering passage to another world entirely. Maria waited with the impossibility of her presence in this sacred space. Her worn shoes whispered against stones that had been walked by saints and sinners, popes and pilgrims, but never by someone like her. Never by a homeless woman clutching a book of poetry and wearing a coat that had seen too many nights under open sky. Pope Leo XIV walked beside her, his white cassock a steady beacon in her peripheral vision as they moved through gardens that seemed to exist in a different century. The Swiss guards flanked them at a respectful distance, their faces professionally neutral despite the unprecedented nature of their escort duty. Behind them, Antonio followed in shell-shocked silence, his leather folder hanging forgotten at his side. "I used to bring my students through these gates," Maria Elena whispered, her voice barely audible above the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. "But we always stayed on the tour routes, the approved paths. I never imagined." She stopped speaking, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of walking as a guest rather than a visitor in this place. She had taught about, but never truly entered. They passed a group of Vatican gardeners who had paused in their morning work to watch the procession. Their faces showed the same stunned recognition that had marked the crowd outside. This was the Pope, walking with a homeless woman as if it were the most natural thing in the world. One elderly man crossed himself as they passed, though whether in blessing or bewilderment was impossible to tell. "My mother always dreamed of seeing the Sistine Chapel," Maria Elena said suddenly, her emotions spilling over in fragments. "She saved money for years for a pilgrimage, but then she got sick, and ... double quotes, her voice cracked. She never made it." Leo slowed his pace, allowing her words to settle in the morning air. "What would she think of this moment?" he asked gently. Maria Elena looked around at the magnificent architecture, the perfectly manicured paths, the sense of centuries of prayer soaked into every stone. "She wouldn't believe it," she said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "She'd think I was making it up, that grief had finally driven me completely mad." They reached the steps of the Apostolic Palace, where more staff members had gathered, their faces a mixture of curiosity and poorly concealed alarm. Cardinal Bertoli appeared at Leo's elbow, his diplomatic smile stretched thin. "Your Holiness," he murmured urgently, "the guest quarters will require preparation. Background checks, medical clearance, proper documentation, then see that it's done." Leo replied simply, never breaking stride as he began to climb the marble steps. Maria Elena hesitated at the threshold, looking up at the imposing facade. That had intimidated countless visitors over the centuries. The poetry book trembled in her hands. "I don't belong here," she whispered. Leo turned back to her, his eyes holding the same gentle certainty that had first drawn her into conversation. "Neither did I 3 months ago," he said softly. "But sometimes belonging isn't about deserving. Sometimes it's about being invited." The guest room was simple but elegant cream-colored walls, a single bed with crisp white linens, and a window that looked out over the Vatican gardens. Maria Elena stood just inside the doorway, afraid to move further into the space, as if her presence might somehow contaminate the pristine sanctuary that had been prepared for her. Sister Catherine, an elderly nun with kind eyes and efficient hands, bustled about, setting out fresh towels and a basin of warm water. She moved with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades caring for others, showing no judgment or surprise at the unusual circumstances that had brought a homeless woman into these hallowed quarters. "There's a shower just through there," Sister Catherine said gently, indicating a small adjoining bathroom, "and I've left some clean clothes. That should fit. Nothing fancy, but comfortable." She paused at the door, offering Maria Elena a smile that held decades of compassion. "Take all the time you need, dear." When they were alone, Pope Leo XIV settled into a simple wooden chair by the window while Maria Elena remained standing. Still clutching her poetry book like a lifeline, the silence stretched between them, heavy with everything that had led to this impossible moment. "I keep waiting to wake up," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "This morning I was reading Montali by the Vatican walls, and now ... she gestured helplessly around the room. "Now you're reading Montali inside the Vatican walls," Leo observed with gentle humor. "Perhaps that's not as large a journey as it seems." Maria Elena's laugh was hollow, tinged with bitterness. "You don't understand. 3 years ago, I had tenure at one of Rome's most prestigious schools. I had a pension, health insurance, a beautiful apartment near Piazza Navona. I was respected." Her voice cracked. "I mattered." Leo leaned forward slightly, his expression encouraging her to continue. "When Mama's diagnosis came, I thought I could manage both teaching and caring for her. But Alzheimer's doesn't follow schedules." The words came faster now, as if a dam had burst. She wandered off during parent-teacher conferences. "I missed classes to take her to doctors. The administration was understanding at first, then concerned, then ... double quotes, she shrugged. They gave my position to someone more reliable." She moved to the window, staring out at gardens she never could have imagined entering. "The insurance covered some of her medications, but not the experimental treatments. I sold everything: my books, my grandmother's jewelry, finally the apartment itself. When she died, I had nothing left except debt and the clothes on my back. And the poetry," Leo added softly. Maria Elena touched the worn cover of the Montali collection. "She gave this to me when I started teaching. Said that literature would always give me a home, even when everything else failed." Her voice broke completely. Leo rose and moved. To stand beside her at the window, in the garden below, a priest walked slowly along the paths, reading his breviary in the morning light. "What would you tell your students," he asked quietly, "about the difference between temporary circumstances and permanent worth?" Maria Elena looked at him through tears. "That's easy to say when you're not the one sleeping on cardboard." "Yes," Leo agreed. "It is." The video spread across social media like wildfire shaky phone footage of Pope Leo XIV walking hand in hand with a homeless woman through the Vatican gates. Her worn coat, a stark contrast to his pristine white. Within hours, news networks were leading with the story, and the Vatican's switchboard was overwhelmed with calls from journalists, bishops, and concerned Catholics around the world. In his office overlooking St. Peter's Square, Cardinal Bertoli stared at his computer screen where the footage played on repeat. Behind him, 3 other senior officials huddled around printouts of early newspaper headlines. "Pope breaks protocol for homeless woman." "Vatican opens doors to street dweller." And most problematic of all, "Holy Father or reckless revolutionary." The German bishops are asking for clarification, reported Monsignor Toretti, his voice tight with diplomatic strain. Cardinal Bertoli rubbed his temples, and the Americans split down the middle. The progressives are calling it prophetic witness. The conservatives are questioning the Pope's judgment. Toretti consulted his notes. Archbishop Williams used the phrase dangerous precedent. Meanwhile, in the Vatican kitchens, the staff moved with unusual energy, their conversations punctuated by glances toward the upper floors where their unexpected guest was settling in. Sister Catherine, who had spent the morning preparing Maria Elena's room, found herself defending the Pope's decision to anyone who would listen. "Did you see her eyes?" she asked Sister Maria, who was kneading bread with perhaps more force than necessary. "That woman has suffered, yes, but she has dignity, intelligence. The Holy Father saw something we might have missed." Sister Maria's response was noncommittal, but her kneading grew gentler. In Rome's homeless shelters, word of the Pope's gesture spread with the swift efficiency of street-level communication networks. Father Giuseppe, who ran a soup kitchen near Termini station, fielded dozens of questions from regulars who had seen the news. "Does this mean the Vatican will take us all in?" asked an elderly man missing several teeth. "I think," Father Giuseppe replied carefully, It means the Holy Father wants us to remember that every person has a name. Back in the Apostolic Palace, Antonio sat at his desk, surrounded by a completely reorganized schedule, 3 phones ringing simultaneously, and a growing pile of interview requests from international media. His carefully ordered world had become a maze of crisis management. And yet, as he watched crowds gather in St. Peter's Square, Bologna, carrying handmade signs supporting the Pope's decision, he couldn't shake the feeling that something profound was shifting. His computer chimed with a new email. The subject line read, "From a former homeless teacher in Chicago, thank you." Antonio stared at the message, realizing that Pope Leo XIV's impulsive morning walk had somehow become a moment that resonated far beyond Vatican walls, touching people who understood, perhaps better than any cardinal, what it meant to be seen. When the world had decided you were invisible. 3 days after her arrival, Maria Elena found herself in the Vatican Library's smallest reading room, surrounded by a half-dozen children whose parents worked in various capacities throughout the papal state. 8-year-old Giuseppe, whose father maintained the gardens, sat cross-legged on the floor with wide eyes fixed on the worn poetry book in her hands. Beside him, twins Anna and Marco, their mother, worked in the Vatican post office, leaned forward with the intense concentration that only children bring to stories. "But why did the poet write about bones?" asked Lucia, the daughter of one of the Swiss guards, her brow furrowed in the way of someone genuinely trying to understand. Maria Elena felt the familiar flutter of recognition in her chest, the moment when a student's curiosity sparked something deeper than mere comprehension. For 3 years, she had forgotten this feeling, buried it beneath the weight of loss and survival. Now, sitting on a simple wooden chair in this ancient library, she remembered why she had become a teacher in the first place. Montali wrote about cuttlefish bones because they wash up on beaches after storms, she explained gently, closing the book and leaning forward. They're what remains after the creature inside is gone. The poet is asking us, what part of ourselves survives when everything else is stripped away? The children considered this with the seriousness that childhood brings to metaphor. Giuseppe raised his hand tentatively. "Like when my Nonna died, we kept her rosary." "Exactly like that," Maria Elena said, her voice catching slightly. "The rosary carries her prayers, her love. That's what survives." From the doorway, Pope Leo XIV watched silently as Maria Elena guided the children through concepts that would challenge university students, her natural teaching instincts flowing back like muscle memory. She had showered, changed into simple but clean clothes provided by the Vatican staff. And the transformation was remarkable, not just in her appearance, but in the way she carried herself when doing what she was born to do. "Now, Maria Elena," continued, "who can tell me about something they've kept that reminds them of someone important?" The conversation that followed revealed the rich inner lives of these Vatican children. Marco's collection of postcards from his grandfather's travels, Anna's pressed flowers from her grandmother's garden, Giuseppe's wooden cross carved by his uncle. Maria Elena listened to each story with the patience of someone who understood that teaching was as much about hearing as it was about speaking. As the informal lesson drew to a close, the children gathered around her chair, reluctant to leave. Lucia tugged gently on Maria Elena's sleeve. "Will you teach us again tomorrow?" Maria Elena looked toward the doorway where Leo still stood, his presence offering silent encouragement. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt the stirring of something that might, eventually, become hope. "If your parents agree," she said softly, "I think I'd like that very much." The children erupted in quiet cheers, mindful of the library's atmosphere, and began planning what they wanted to learn next. In their enthusiasm, Maria Elena caught a glimpse of who she had been before the world broke apart and, perhaps, who she might become again. 2 weeks later, a corner of the Vatican's inner courtyard had been transformed into something unprecedented in the Papal State's history. Small but dignified outreach center where homeless individuals could access basic services without surrendering their humanity at the door. Simple wooden tables were arranged under a canvas canopy, where Vatican volunteers distributed food, medical supplies, and most importantly, treated each visitor as a person worthy of conversation rather than charity. Maria Elena moved between the tables with quiet efficiency, her teacher's instincts helping her navigate the delicate social dynamics that emerged when people who had been invisible suddenly found themselves seen. She paused beside an elderly man named Roberto who had been living in Termini Station for the better part of a year, and handed him a steaming cup of coffee. "The social worker will be here at 2, she said gently, sitting across from him at the small table. "Sister Catherine thinks she might have found you a place in the transitional housing program." Roberto's weathered hands wrapped around the cup as if it contained more than warmth. "You really think they'll take someone like me?" His voice carried the accumulated weight of a dozen rejections, 100 times when hope had proved false. "I think," Maria Elena replied carefully, "that everyone deserves a chance to try again." Nearby, Dr. Benedetti, a volunteer physician from a local hospital, examined the infected cut on a young woman's hand while speaking to her in a gentle tone he might use with any patient in his practice. The woman, barely 20, with prematurely aged eyes, flinched at his touch but didn't pull away. "This needs proper cleaning and antibiotics," he said, reaching for his medical bag. "When did you last have a tetanus shot?" The simple question, asked without judgment or condescension, brought tears to the young woman's eyes. She couldn't remember the last time someone had been concerned about her medical history rather than demanding she move along. From the loggia above, Pope Leo XIV watched the scene unfold with the satisfaction of someone witnessing a necessary experiment bearing unexpected fruit. Cardinal Bertoli appeared beside him, his earlier opposition tempered by the practical reality of what they had created. "The initial resistance from some quarters has quieted," the cardinal reported. Even Archbishop Williams acknowledged in his latest statement that this approach treats people with appropriate dignity. Leo nodded, but his attention remained focused on Maria Elena, who was now helping an older woman fill out paperwork for housing assistance. In just 2 weeks, she had become the bridge between two worlds, someone who understood both the language of the streets and the protocols of institutions, who could translate desperate need into actionable plans. "She's remarkable," Cardinal Bertoli observed, following Leo's gaze. "The way she connects with them helps them navigate the systems. It's as if she speaks both languages." "She does," Leo replied quietly. "She speaks the language of someone who remembers what it feels like to fall and what it takes to stand up again." In the courtyard below, Maria Elena looked up and caught sight of the Pope watching from above. She offered a small wave, her smile carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had found her purpose again. 6 months later, Pope Leo XIV stood at the same iron gate where everything had changed, watching Maria Elena, officially the Vatican's coordinator of educational outreach approach, a young man who had been sleeping against the ancient walls for the past 3 nights. The morning light fell across the scene with the same golden quality that had illuminated their first encounter, but everything else had transformed beyond. Recognition, the small encampment that had once huddled in the shadows of Vatican walls, had evolved into something more organized, more hopeful. Clean water stations had been installed, a small medical tent operated twice weekly. Most importantly, people here knew they had names, and that those names mattered to someone. "His name is Francesco Maria Elena," said quietly as she rejoined Leo at the gate. 23 years old, lost his job at a restaurant when it closed during the economic downturn. He's been on the streets for 2 months. She paused, studying the young man who sat with his back against the wall, staring at his worn shoes. "He's ashamed, keeps saying this isn't who he is." Leo nodded, recognizing the familiar refrain. In the months since Maria Elena's arrival had sparked this transformation, they had learned that shame was often the heaviest burden carried by those who found themselves outside society's margins. "What did you tell him? That identity isn't determined by circumstances," Maria Elena replied, echoing words Leo himself had spoken to her in those first difficult days, "and that sometimes we have to let others see our worth before we can remember it ourselves." They walked together through the gate, approaching Francesco with the same gentle intention that had marked Leo's original decision to break protocol. The young man looked up as their shadows fell across him, his eyes widening with recognition and something close to panic. "Your Holiness," he stammered, scrambling to his feet. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, Francesco," Leo said gently, using his name, as Maria Elena had taught him, was always the first step toward restoring dignity. "I'm Leo. This is my friend Maria Elena. We were wondering if you might join us for breakfast." The invitation hung in the morning air, simple and revolutionary in equal measure. 6 months ago, such a scene would have been unthinkably a pope, casually inviting a homeless man to share a meal. Now, it had become what Maria Elena liked to call the new normal. Though she suspected there was nothing normal about it at all, Francesco looked between them uncertainly. I don't have anything to offer in return." Maria Elena stepped forward, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who remembered being in exactly this position. "That's the point," she said softly. "Sometimes grace works best when we can't pay it back." "The difficult part," Maria Elena said, as they entered the courtyard where breakfast was being served, at simple wooden tables, is teaching people that accepting help doesn't diminish them, that being vulnerable isn't the same as being weak. Leo watched as Francesco was welcomed at a table where Roberto now housed and working part-time in the Vatican Gardens-made room with the natural grace of someone who understood that today's helper might be tomorrow's person in need. The cycle of dignity, Leo had learned, was perhaps the most sacred circle of all. "You know," he said to Maria Elena as they observed the quiet miracle of community forming around shared meals, and second, "Chances, I keep thinking about that morning when I first saw you reading poetry by these walls." Maria Elena smiled, her hand unconsciously touching the small bag where she still carried her worn copy of Montale. "What about it? I thought I was taking a walk," Leo replied. "I had no idea I was walking toward the future." In the courtyard, Francesco tentatively accepted a cup of coffee from Sister Catherine, his posture already beginning to shift from shame toward something that might, eventually, become hope.